Okay, hello everyone, my name is Paul. I've been an English teacher for quite a long time. I've decided to start making some revision guides for students and putting them on YouTube. So this is the very first one that I've ever done, but what I'm going to be doing today is looking at some key quotes from An Inspector Calls, which is a play that I love to teach and I try to make as interesting as possible for my students. So I'm going to look at each character from the play and look at 3 key quotes from each character and just talk you through them, why they're important quotes, why the characters say them, why Priestley might have got his characters to say them as well. So the first character that I'm going to look at today is Mrs. Birling. So the first quote that I've got from Mrs. Birling is right at the start of the play in Act 1, when she talks to Sheila, her daughter, about not teasing her brother. And she talks about how men with important work sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. So right from the start of the play, Mrs. Birling acts as a symbol for what's called a patriarchal society, or a society where men have all the power, have all the important roles within society. Mrs. Birling makes clear to Sheila, a young woman in Edwardian society, that she needs to let men have their time, have their opportunities to talk to each other about the business that they have. It therefore implying that actually the business that Sheila does, what Sheila does in life, isn't actually very important. So Mrs. Birling, right at the start of the play, acts as a symbol for that patriarchal society where men have the power over women. So that's one really important. The second one I want to look at with Mrs. Birling is the stage directions when she comes into the play in Act 2. It says that she enters briskly and self-confidently, quite out of key with the little scene that's just taken place. So Mrs. Birling has no idea what Gerald and Sheila have just been talking about in terms of Gerald's relationship or what they've been saying to each other. So we've got a really good example here of what's called dramatic irony, where the audience of a play know more than some of the characters. Mrs. Birling walks in self-confidently, she walks in briskly, she's her normal self. Unlike some of the other characters, she's not really had the interaction with the inspector that, say, Sheila or Gerald has had so far. She's been away from the action in another room, not on stage. So she's quite ignorant of what the inspector is, how he talks to people, how he has no real respect for class in an Edwardian society. Those stage directions, although they're not read out to the audience, they are important because the actor playing Mrs. Birling has to get across that sense of importance, that sense of I am the top dog here, I'm in charge of the family, which is quite unusual in a patriarchal society, but Mrs. Birling does make sure that her husband is seen as being quite powerful in the family too. But she comes in and she has a power struggle with the inspector. She's a very important character. She represents Edwardian values, and so it's important that she's seen as being, thinks that she's great, that she's top dog. Okay, and then when she's started to speak to the inspector and there's a power struggle that takes place between them, she starts to see what he's about, how he talks to people, and is no respecter of class as well. And she eventually says to the inspector, the way that you speak to this child, you've had quite an impression on my daughter. So she refers to her daughter as a child, which links back right to the start of the play, which I'll be talking about with Sheila, where Sheila is perceived by her family to be childish, and she behaves in a childish manner. Mrs. Birling hasn't changed from the start of the play, so she still sees her daughter as being quite childish. Okay, so she refers to her as a child, but also she says to the inspector, you seem to have had quite an impact on my daughter. The inspector's response to that is, we often do on the young, and that pronoun we is important. Who is he referring to when he says we? Can't mean police officers. There's a hint there to the audience about what the inspector actually represents. And also this idea that having an impact on younger people, creating a young and old divide, a generation gap between those two generations within the play. Here we really see that starting to come through when Mrs. Birling, part of that older generation, is differentiating, or is being differentiated from the younger characters such as Sheila and Eric. Okay. So the next character I'm going to look at is Mr. Birling, the head of the family, the patriarch, the one that Mrs. Birling makes sure has control of the family right at the start of the play. I've got 3 quotes quite early on from the play when Priestley establishes the kind of character Mr. Birling is and how much control and power he has over the family. In the first quote, Mr. Birling is talking to Gerald. Gerald is about to get engaged, well, he is engaged to Sheila, he's about to get married to Sheila. Mr. Birling makes very, very clear that he is the kind of son-in-law that he's always wanted. They might think that's great, he's got this perfect son-in-law, but what are his reasons for Gerald and Sheila getting married? Why does he want them to get married? The first reason that he gives is it's to do with business, it's to do with money. By Gerald and Sheila getting married, it means that Mr. Birling can unite his business with Croft and Sons, so basically putting the 2 businesses together. And he says, I'm just going to read the quote, he says, "I've been friendly rivals in business for some time now with your father." So it's about business, it's about money, it's quite a cynical approach to marriage, and the audience can very clearly make up their mind about the kind of character that Mr. Birling is. He's driven by money, he's driven by capital, and that's what he represents. Okay, so the second quote that I'm going to talk about, again from Act 1, is Mr. Birling talking to his son Eric, and he says to Eric, "Listen, you've got a lot to learn yet." So he treats his son like a child, just like Mrs. Birling treats Sheila like a child. They're seen as being young, naive and innocent at the start of the play. They don't really know anything about the real world. And he says to his son, "I'm a hard-headed, practical man of business." So he uses those adjectives, hard-headed, to describe himself. He has a really clear sense of self-importance. He thinks he's the bee's knees, he's top dog, just like his wife does as well. And he says to his son, look, there's absolutely no chance of war. Eric previously said, what about war? Quite an astute comment. In 1912, when this play is set, that's 2 years before the First World War. The First World War, which lasted from 1914 to 1918, had a mammoth, a catastrophic impact on British society. Here we've got Mr. Birling, who thinks he's fantastic, thinks he's very, very smart and thinks he's very, very powerful, saying to Eric and to the audience, there's no chance of war. But the audience who were watching this after the Second World War know that what Mr. Birling is talking about is utter nonsense. There were 2 world wars since the play was set and took place. So there's that element of dramatic irony where the audience know more than some of the characters. There's that sense that Mr. Birling is quite foolish and quite stupid because he's so confident in what he says, and yet we know it is utter rubbish. And then lastly, again, this is from Act 1, Mr. Birling says about people talking about war, he says to them, fiddlesticks. He is arrogant, he is patronising, and he is very much condescending to those people. And yet, of course, as an audience watching, we know he is utterly wrong. So what Priestley's done is he encapsulates the arrogance of the upper classes in Edwardian society, and he gets across the audience this certainty they have that war will not happen. And of course there's the very famous quote about Arthur Birling and the Titanic as well, which sunk very soon after he was talking about it. Because of that dramatic irony, Priestley's able to portray Birling as foolish and arrogant, and Priestley uses Birling as a symbol of capitalism, of capital, of greed within Edwardian society and the Edwardian upper classes. So the next character that I'm going to look at is Sheila Birling, the daughter of the Birlings, one of the younger generation within the family. She's a really powerful character because at the start of the play she's shown to be quite young, naive and innocent, and the best quote to show that is when she's talking to her mother, Mrs. Birling. She's just received her engagement ring from Gerald and she says, "Oh, isn't it wonderful? Look, Mummy, isn't it a beauty? Oh, darling." And then she kisses Gerald. So the way that she talks to her mother, the way that she talks to Gerald, she seems quite young and innocent. She refers to her mum as mummy, and the use of the dashes within that quote emphasises to the actor to really get across the excitement that she's having at the start of the play because she's receiving that ring. What this quote does is also emphasise the materialism, the obsession with material goods that Sheila has. We know later on in the play it's that drive and desire for materialism that effectively angers Sheila into sacking Eva from Millward's, the hat shop, the clothing shop that she goes to. So because of that, she is quite material, she's quite shallow, and as the play progresses, her understanding of the world and her understanding of society becomes deeper and deeper, and the audience can see that as she changes throughout the play. And a really good quote to show the change that Sheila goes through is in Act 2, when she's talking to Gerald and she says, "Why, of course, you fool, he knows," referring to the inspector. Sheila's the one who really picks up on the power of the inspector straight away. She's able to see the influence that he can have over the characters, the fact that he seems to know everything in advance. He's not coming into questions as a normal police officer would do without knowing what's happened. He's trying to eke out answers from them, trying to get them to feel a sense of guilt about what's happened with Eva or Daisy. And she is the first person who really recognises that, who really sees what he's doing there, what he's trying to get out of this family. So she sees that power, which makes her quite intelligent, quite astute because of that. If you tie that in with what I said previously about Eric saying, "What about war?" Those two young characters, despite being given absolutely no respect at the start of the play, are probably the two most aware, the two most astute characters in the play. And Priestley's doing that deliberately. He's trying to give credit to the younger generation, trying to show actually that they are aware, that they are articulate and they are intelligent. And then there's that stage direction at the end of this quote, which he says, "She looks at him almost in triumph." Now, of course, the audience can't read that, but the actor who's playing Sheila has to really think carefully about her body language, her hand gestures, her mannerisms. How is she going to get across the idea that she's almost in triumph? So that's an interesting stage direction, because it seems to suggest that Sheila is almost siding with the inspector, that she agrees with what he's doing. So there's a clear divide that's forming with some of the characters already through that. And then she also repeats that phrase, "You'll see, you'll see." So she's worked out what the inspector's about, and she's almost waiting for the other characters to get trapped by it as well. So it's an interesting quote. There's a lot you can pick out of it in terms of analysing the character of Sheila. And then lastly, the inspector talks to Sheila about young women in society beyond the social bubble that she's kind of found herself in for most of her life. And he talks about how there's people across every city and every town in the country who are living in a situation just like Eva was. And Sheila's response to that is, but they're not cheap labour, they're people. So Mr. Birling was previously talking about how there was a strike at his factory and he had to dismiss Eva because of it and her actions within that strike. But Sheila takes a different perspective. She realises that people like Eva are people. They're not just objects, they're not just things, they're not just there to make you money, they're not just cheap labour. And that adjective cheap next to labour is really important, because it exaggerates what she thinks about the existing attitudes towards working class people in the Edwardian period by the upper class within the society. And she has that contrast. She says they're people. So she doesn't see them as being below her, she sees them as equals. So that change is really starting to take place in Sheila. She's previously been protected, been in a social bubble, and now she's popping that bubble, she's coming out of it, and she's starting to question the way society is for herself. Okay, I'm going to move on to Eric now. Eric is an interesting character, as I'm sure you know from the video clips or the parts of the play that you've been studying already. But he very, very quickly becomes a character that's very self-aware and is able to reflect on what he's done and feel very, very guilty about it, just like his sister. He's done arguably a lot worse than his sister. Yes, she helped to get Eva unemployed for her to lose her job, but Eric effectively sexually assaulted Eva and took advantage of her. He saw her as an object. It wasn't out of petty jealousy that he attacked her. He simply took on his role as a member of the upper class and saw Eva as an object. And he does feel guilty, because at the end of the play he talks about what's the use of talking and behaving sensibly. We're beginning to pretend that nothing's happened at all. He can't just forget, he can't just brush everything under the carpet now that they believe the inspector might not be real. He says, look, we've got to think about this. I still did what I did. The girl's still dead, isn't she? So those rhetorical questions at the end of the quote help to emphasise his frustration at the way that his family are behaving, the guilt that he feels about his own actions, the sense of frustration that there's nothing he can do about it. Eva's gone, you know, she's dead, or it doesn't even matter that, you know, she's still dead, and they can't bring her back. And Sheila feels exactly the same way. But for Mr. Birling, for Mrs. Birling, and to a lesser extent for Gerald, it's very much about protecting their own reputation, protecting their own identities within society, rather than reflecting on what's happened and feeling bad about it. And Eric keeps reiterating it towards the end of the play. He says, whoever the inspector was, it doesn't matter, I still did what I did. It doesn't matter if Eva is a composite of different people, or if she's a work of fiction. He still sexually assaulted that girl. He still got her pregnant. He still stole money from his father's factory. He's done all those wrongs, and his drinking was a way of him covering it up, and not having to reflect on it and think about it. But now it's all out in the open, everyone knows about it. His behaviour towards his family changes. He's no longer so strange and half assertive and half shy as he's referred to at the start of the play. He's quite emotive. He's standing up to his parents and saying, this is wrong, we have to do something about this. We can't just ignore what's happened. The rest of you did what you did to her. And then also there's a really good quote earlier on the play when Arthur's talking about how he got Eva fired from his factory, and he says, I couldn't have done anything else. And Gerald says, no, I completely agree with you. But Eric actually questions his father, and he says, you could have kept her on. He says that, you know, I call it tough luck. You could have kept her on the factory, you didn't need to fire her. So just like Sheila, he's not towing that line. He does question the actions of his parents, and he thinks, well, that's unjust, that's unfair. So he has a conscience, and that grows throughout the play. And when eventually everything comes out and he's aware of everything and his family are aware of everything, that's when he's able to stand up to his parents and say, what's happened is wrong and we have to feel guilty about it. I'm going to talk about the inspector now. Very, very interesting character within the play. Very early on in the play, when he's speaking to Mr. Birling, Mr. Birling talks to him about he can't accept any responsibility. We can't have everything that's happened to everybody being the responsibility of everyone. It would be very awkward, wouldn't it? And the inspector's very, very curt and blunt response to that is, very awkward. Now that is the inspector in a nutshell. Mr. Birling talks endlessly. He's talking about how it'd be utterly ridiculous for everyone to look after each other. But the inspector chooses his words really, really carefully, and he's able to cut through all that and the power of the Birlings and the social standing of them. And he reiterates and repeats what Birling says. He says very awkward. But the way that the actor playing the inspector says that short sentence is very, very important. Is he sarcastic? Is he repeating what Birling said to make a mockery of it? Is he implying something about, with those words very awkward, what's he trying to say? So it's noticeable to the audience because it's so short and because it's so blunt. And even though he's saying the words that Birling is saying, he's getting a different meaning across to the audience by using such a short sentence. Yes, it would be very awkward if everyone had to look after each other. Yes, it would, but it would still be, in Priestley's mind, in the inspector's mind, an important thing that needs to happen. People cannot be islands, they cannot be separate from each other. They are all members of one body, and we all have to take responsibility for each other within a society. And Mr. Birling at times gets quite angry at the inspector because of the way that he talks to the characters, because he is no respecter of class. And at one point, with the stage director saying the inspector massively, because he's got so much power over the Birlings, he says, public men, Mr. Birling, have responsibilities. as well as privileges. So Mr. Birling effectively threatens the inspector, saying, I'm a public man, I've been Lord Mayor, I'm a very important person. But reputation means nothing to the inspector. It's about the actions you have, the words that you use, the way that you portray yourselves to other people within society. That's far more important than your social status, your social standing. And he says, look, you have responsibilities as well as a privilege that you've had all your life. You have those responsibilities in society. So the way that he speaks to those characters is so blunt and so to the point that it really shocks them. They don't know what to make of it, because normally people in an Edwardian society, lower down in society, would be very respectful. What we call doffing their caps, would never say anything offensive or rude or blunt to those characters just because of their social standing. But here the inspector comes in and he just crashes through all of that. He's very much like a grenade that just comes into the play and just blows up everything that existed before. He completely changes what's called the paradigm, or the way of thinking. Okay, and then this is a really famous quote from towards the end of the play, just before the inspector leaves, and then there is the additional scenes afterwards with just the family talking to each other about what's happened. And he talks about, we don't live alone. We are all members of one body. So that metaphor of being members of a body, we're not individuals within society, we are one society and we need to help each other. That's effectively what he's saying. We are responsible for each other. But he also has this quite disturbing undertone towards the end of it, where he talks about, if men will not learn that lesson, that we are members of one body, they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. So that triplet, or that what you might call a rule of three, at the end of that quote, it suggests the idea of revolution, it suggests the idea of violence, that if the upper classes are not willing to take responsibility for their own actions and help the rest of society to use their influence and wealth to make changes, then there will be violence, there will be revolution. The play is set in 1912, and at this time there was all sorts of things happening in Russia. Russia had what was called a Tsar, who was a very powerful king. He had complete control over society. He's what's called an autocrat. And there was the Russian Revolution, and there was the Bolshevik uprising, and Russian society eventually became communist, which is a very different way of running a society. So it's very much the complete antithesis, or the opposite of capitalism. And that's hinted at here, this idea that if people are mistreated for long enough and they're ignored for long enough, there will be violence. So there's that suggestion there. And of course the two world wars happened, and millions of people in Britain died as a result of those two world wars. And in 1945, Winston Churchill, the hero of the war, and the Prime Minister and the leader of the Conservative Party, he lost the general election in 1945 to Clement Attlee's Labour Party, because Labour promised a socialist agenda, a socialist manifesto, including things like the NHS in terms of pensions and benefits, and a welfare state that would help the most needy in society. People effectively wanted change in politics in society because of the violence and the impact that the two world wars had. So Priestley's hinting at that in this quote, and he's hinting at things like the Russian Revolution. Things have to change in society, and 1945 would have been a time of real upheaval, of real change, and Priestley's just reiterating that, making it clear to his audience here, and to think about what kind of a society they want in Britain as well. And then lastly, Gerald, the young man about town within the play, he's talking to the inspector in Act 2, and he's talking about the role of women in society, because gender with Sheila and with Mrs. Birling is really, really important in this play as well, which I've touched upon much earlier on in the video. So Inspector says, you think young women ought to be protected against unpleasant and disturbing things? And Gerald replies to that, well, yes. So he feels that someone like Sheila shouldn't be part of these kind of conversations. If they're unpleasant, they're disturbing, they should be protected, they should be treated like children. So because she's a woman, she should be treated completely differently. So Gerald's quite sexist attitudes, what we call sexist now, come through here, and the inspector questions him, and he then replies back to Gerald with this idea that, well, Eva wasn't protected from unpleasant and disturbing things, so how can you possibly say that? So Gerald's made to look like a fool, and every time Gerald tries to stand up for himself against the inspector, he's quite quickly shot down. And at some points in the play, he does seem quite sympathetic to what the inspector's saying. The way that he treated Daisy, the fact that he gave her lodgings, that he took her in and he gave her money to look after herself once they split up, does show that he has some sympathy and some sort of conscience. But the way that he behaves towards the end of the play shows that he's not that different to Mr. and Mrs. Birling in terms of his attitudes towards society. He talks about his relationship with Daisy in quite some detail. He says that it was inevitable that they had a relationship. She was young and pretty and warm-hearted and intensely grateful. I became once the most important person in her life. So for Gerald, he can play the knight in shining armour. He can be the hero to this woman. So it's almost like he's going on a little bit of an ego trip. But he does have genuine feelings for Daisy. We can see that in the fact that he has to leave the Birling household to think about what's happened. But at the same time, this is again about his power and his abuse of power, that he can play this role for someone like Daisy, and it's possibly more about him than it is about her, but that's open to your own interpretation. Okay, and then right at the end of the play in Act 3, when they discover the inspector is not a real inspector and they found out that actually no one has been taken to the infirmary that night, that's when Gerald suggests to Sheila about giving her back her engagement ring. So just like Mr. and Mrs. Birling, he wants to brush everything under the carpet. He wants to forget about what's happened and to pretend it never happened and to go back to the way they were, the way things were. And he even says, everything's all right now, Sheila. So forget about it. It's nothing happened. It's all fine. Forget about it. Let's just brush it under the carpet. But of course, she can't do that because she's got a conscience and she still did the things she did. And it's what Eric said. He still did what he did, and everyone still did what they did. Yet Gerald here is determined to try and get rid of all that and pretend it never happened. And of course, he's the one who rings the infirmary, despite the damage that could possibly do to his reputation. He's the one who rings them. Okay, so I've been through every major character in the play. I haven't spoken about Edna. I know that lots of students love Edna, but she doesn't really say a lot, and she is an important character in many ways, but because she doesn't say anything, I can't really talk about her in terms of key quotes. But I hope you found the video useful. If you click on the links at the end of it, you'll go to my shop with lots of revision guides and resources for both students and for teachers. You can subscribe to my videos, which I'm hoping to make quite a few from now onwards. You can go to my Twitter feed, to my Facebook feed, there's all sorts of things at the end. Thank you for listening, I hope that was useful.